Well, I'm trying to undo a mistake I made some years ago and have written about actually in one of your volumes, and rethink the idea that the way to understand the mind is to take it apart into simpler minds and then take those apart into still simpler minds until you get down to minds that can be replaced by a machine. This is called homuncular functionalism, because you take the whole person, you break the whole person down into 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 sub-persons that are basically agents. They're homunculi. And this looks like a regress, but it's not, because it's only a finite regress, because you take each of those in turn and you break it down into a group of stupider, more specialized homunculi, and you keep going until you arrive at parts that you can replace with a machine. And that's a great way of thinking about cognitive science. It's what good old-fashioned AI tried to do, and still trying to do. And I think the idea is basically right. But when I first conceived of it, I made a big mistake. I was at that point enamored of the McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron. McCulloch and Pitts had put together this idea of a very simple artificial neuron. They had the idea of a computational neuron which had multiple inputs and a single branching output, and a threshold for firing, and the inputs are either inhibitory or excitatory. They proved that out of a neural net made of these logical neurons, you could compute anything you wanted to compute. So this was very exciting. It meant that you could treat the brain as a computer and treat the neuron as a sort of basic switching element in a computer. And that was certainly an inspiring oversimplification. Everybody knew it was an oversimplification, but people didn't realize how much. And more recently, it's become clear to me that it's a dramatic oversimplification, because each neuron, far from being a simple logical switch, each neuron is a little agent with an agenda, and they are much more autonomous and much more interesting than any switch. And so then the question is, what happens to your ideas about computational architecture when you think of individual neurons not as dutiful slaves or as simple machines, but as agents that have to be kept in line, and that have to be properly rewarded, and that can form coalitions and cabals and organizations, alliances. And this vision of the brain as a sort of social arena of political warring forces, different groups of neurons, which seemed like a sort of amusing fantasy at first, is now becoming something that I take more and more seriously. And it's fed by a lot of different currents. David Haig in evolutionary biology has these lovely papers on intrapersonal conflict, where he's talking about how even at the level of the genetics, even at the level of the conflict between the genes you get from your mother and the genes you get from your father, the so-called pedunal and medunal genes, that those are in opponent relations, and that if they get out of whack, a lot of serious imbalances can happen that show up as particular as psychological anomalies. So we're beginning to come to grips with the idea that your brain is not this well-organized hierarchical control system where everything is in order. Very Germanic vision of a bureaucracy. In fact, it's it's much more like anarchy with some elements of democracy, or sometimes you can achieve stability and mutual aid and sort of calm, united front, and then everything goes hunky-dory. But then it's always possible for things to get out of whack and for one alliance or another to gain control, and then you get obsessions and delusions and so forth. So you begin to think about the normal, well-tempered mind, in effect, the well-organized mind, as an achievement, not as the base state, something that was only achieved when all is going well. But still, in the general run of humanity, most of us are pretty well put together most of the time. This gives a very different vision of what the architecture is like. And I'm just trying to get my head around how to think about that. What we're seeing right now in cognitive science is something that I've been anticipating for years, and now it's happening. And it's happening so fast I can't keep up with it. We're now drowning in data, and we're also happily drowning in bright young people who have grown up with this stuff and for whom it's just second nature to think in these computational, quite abstract terms. And it simply wasn't possible for adults to get their head around all these different topics 30 years ago. And now a suitably motivated kid can arrive at college already primed to go on these issues. It's very exciting, and they're just going to run away from us, I think, and it's going to be fun to watch. So the vision of the brain as a computer, which I still champion, is changing so fast. Yeah, the brain's a computer, but it's so different from any computer that you're used to. It's not like your desktop or your laptop at all. And it's not like your iPhone, except in some ways. It's a much more interesting phenomenon. Now, what Turing gave us for the first time, and this is, without Turing, you just couldn't do any of this, I think, is he gave us a way of thinking about and taking seriously and thinking in a disciplined way about phenomena that have, as I like to say, trillions of moving parts. Until late 20th century, nobody knew how to take seriously a machine with a trillion moving parts. It was just mind-boggling. You couldn't do it. But computer science gives us actually the ideas, the concepts of levels, virtual machines implemented in virtual machines, implemented in virtual machines, and so forth. We have these nice ideas of sort of recursive reorganization, of which your iPhone is just one example, and a very structured and very rigid one at that. We're getting away from the rigidity of that model, which was worth trying for all it was worth. I mean, you go for the low-hanging fruit first. First, you try to make minds as simple as possible. You make them as much like digital computers, as much like von Neumann machines as possible. It doesn't work. Now we know why it doesn't work pretty well. So you're right, you're going to have a parallel architecture, because after all, the brain is obviously massively parallel. Well, it's going to be a connectionist network. Yeah, but although we know the many talents of connectionist networks, how do you knit them together into one big fabric that can do all the things? Who's in charge? What kind of controls? I think control is the real key. And you begin to realize that control in brains is very different from control in computers. Control in your commercial computer is very much a carefully designed top-down thing. You really don't have to worry about one part of your laptop going rogue and trying out something on its own that the rest of the system doesn't want to do. No, they're all slaves. If they're agents, they're slaves. They're prisoners and they're slaves. They have very clear job descriptions. They get fed every day. They don't have to worry about where the energy is coming from. And they're not ambitious. They just do what they're asked to do. And brilliant. You get all the power of computers out of these mindless little robotic slave prisoners. But that's not the way your brain is organized. Your brain is, they are imprisoned. Each neuron is imprisoned in your brain. I now think of these as cells within cells, as cells within prison cells. When you realize that every neuron in your brain, every cell in your body, every human cell in your body, leaving aside all the symbionts, is a direct descendant of eukaryotic cells that lived and fended for themselves for about 1 billion years as free-swimming, free-living little agents. They fended for themselves and they survived. They had to develop an awful lot of know-how, a lot of talent, a lot of self-protective talent to do that. When they joined forces into multicellular creatures, they gave up a lot of that. They became, in effect, domesticated. They became part of larger, more monolithic organizations. My hunch is that that's true in general. We don't have to worry about our muscle cells rebelling against us or anything like that. When they do, we call it cancer. But in the brain, I think that maybe, this is my wild idea, and maybe only in one species, us, and maybe only in the obviously more volatile parts of the brain, cortical areas. Some little switch has been thrown in the genetics that in effect makes our neurons a little bit feral. A little bit like what happens when you let sheep or pigs go feral and they recover their wild talents very fast. Maybe a lot of the neurons in our brains are capable and, if you like, motivated to be more adventurous, more exploratory, more risky in the way they comport themselves, in the way they live their lives. They're struggling amongst themselves with each other for influence, just for staying alive. And there's competition going on between individual neurons. As soon as that happens, you have room for cooperation, to create alliances, and I suspect that a more freewheeling, anarchic organization is the secret of our greater capacities of creativity, imagination, thinking outside the box and all that. And the price we pay for it is our susceptibility to obsessions, mental illnesses, delusions, and smaller problems. That we got risky brains that are much riskier than the brains of other mammals, even more risky than the brains of chimpanzees, and that this could be partly a matter of a few simple releases and control genes that release some of the innate competitive talent that is still there in the genomes of the individual neurons, and that is then, but I don't think that genetics is the level to explain this. I think you need culture to explain it. I think this is a response to our invention of culture. That culture creates a whole new biosphere, in effect, a whole new cultural sphere of activity, where there's opportunities that don't exist for any other brain tissues in any other creatures. And that this exploration of this space of cultural possibility is what we need to do to explain how the mind works. Now, everything I've just said is very speculative, and I'd be thrilled if 20% of it was right. It's a idea, a way of thinking about brains and minds and culture that is, to me, full of promise. But it may not pan out. I don't worry about that, actually. I'm content to explore this, and if it turns out that I'm just wrong, I'll say, oh, okay, I was wrong. It was fun thinking about it, but I think it might be right. A lot of the science, I'm not myself equipped to work on, but other people can work on it, and they already are in a way. The idea of selfish neurons has already been articulated by Sebastian Sung at MIT in a, I thought, brilliant lecture that he gave, a keynote lecture he gave at Neurosciences out in San Diego a few years ago. I thought, oh yeah, selfish neurons, selfish synapses, cool. Let's push that, see where it leads. But there are many ways of exploring this. One of the still unexplained, so far as I can tell, and amazing features of the brain is its tremendous plasticity. You, like Merzenich, you suture the monkey's fingers together so that it doesn't need as much cortex to represent 3 separate individual digits, and pretty soon those regions that were representing those digits before, they shrink, and that part of the cortex is available to use for other things. If you blindfold yourself for 8 weeks, as Pasquale does his experiments, and you find that your visual cortex starts getting adapted for braille, for haptic perception, for touch. The way the brain can spontaneously reorganize itself in response to trauma of this sort is itself one of the most amazing features of the brain. And if you don't have an architecture that can explain how that could happen and why that is, I think you really have to think in terms of what's in it for them. Why should these neurons be so eager to pitch in and do this other work? Just because they don't have a job, well, they're out of work. They're out of work, they're unemployed. And if you're unemployed, you're not getting your neuromodulators. If you're not getting your neuromodulators, you're not getting your neuromodulator receptors are going to start disappearing, and pretty soon you're going to be really out of work, and then you're going to die. And so, in the same way that people like, well, I think of John Holland, his work on emergence and the emergence of order. His example is New York City. You can always find a place where you can get gefilte fish, or where you can get sushi, or where you can get just about anything in the sun you want, and you don't have to worry about a state bureaucracy that is making sure that supplies get through. No, the market takes care of it. The individual web of entrepreneurship and selfish agency provides a host of services and goods and services, extremely versatile, and an extremely sensitive instrument which responds to needs very quickly. Until the lights go. Well, we're all at the mercy of the power man, and even more, I suppose, today of the internet. But in fact, I am quite concerned that we're becoming hyper fragile as a civilization, and that we are becoming so dependent on technologies that are not as reliable, that have so many conditions that there have to be there for them to work, that we may specialize ourselves into some very serious jams. But in the meantime, I think that thinking about the self-organizational powers of the brain as very much like the self-organizational powers of a city is not a bad idea. And of course it just reeks of over-enthusiastic metaphor. And it's worth reminding ourselves this has been around since Plato. Plato analogizes the mind of a human being to the state. You got the rulers and the guardians and the workers, you know. And this idea that a person is made of lots of little people is even comically simple-minded in some ways. But that doesn't mean it isn't, in a sense, true. We shouldn't shrink from it just because it reminds us of simple-minded versions that have been long discredited. Maybe some not so simple-minded version is the truth. I think my next major project will be trying to take another hard look at cultural evolution and look at the different views of it and see if I can achieve a sort of bird's eye view and establish what role, if any, is there for memes or something like memes in it. What are the other forces that are operating? We are going to have a proper scientific perspective on cultural change. The old-fashioned historical narratives are wonderful, and they're full of gripping detail, and they're even sometimes right, but they only cover a small proportion. They only cover the sort of tip of the iceberg. Basically, the model that we have and have used for, I guess, several thousand years is the model that culture consists of treasures, cultural treasures. They're just like money, or they're just like tools and houses and things, and you bequeath them to your children, and you amass them, and you protect them, and because they're valuable, you maintain them and prepare them, and then you hand them on to the next generation. And some societies are rich and some societies are poor, but it's all goods. And I think that vision is true of only the tip of the iceberg. I think that most of the regularities in culture are not treasures. It's not all opera and science and fortifications and buildings and ships. It includes all kinds of bad habits and ugly patterns and stupid things that don't really matter, but that somehow have got a grip on a society and that are part of the ecology of the human species, in the same way that mud and dirt and grime and fleas are part of the world that we live in. They're not our treasures. we may give our fleas to our children, but we're not trying to. It's not a blessing. It's a curse. And I think there's a lot of cultural fleas. I think there's lots of things that we pass on without even noticing that we're doing it. And of course, language is the prime case of this. Very little deliberate, intentional language instruction goes on, or has to go on. Kids that are never raised with parents pointing out individual objects and say, see, it's a ball, it's red, Look, Johnny, it's a red ball, and this is a cow, and look at the horsey. You don't have to do that. Your kids are going to learn ball and red and horsey and cow just fine. Without that, even if they're quite severely neglected, I mean, that's not a nice observation to make, but it's true. It's language. It's almost impossible not to learn language if you don't have some sort of serious pathology in your brain. You compare that with chimpanzee. There are hundreds, maybe at least hundreds. Let's not worry about whether there's thousands. There's hundreds of chimpanzees that have spent their whole lives in human captivity. They've been institutionalized. They've been sort of like prisoners. And in the course of a day, they hear probably about as many words as a child does. They never show any interest. They never apparently get curious about what that sound is. They can hear it. It's like the rustling of the leaves. It just doesn't register on them. But kids are tuned for that. And it might be a very subtle tuning. I can imagine a few small genetic switches that if they were just in a slightly different position, chimpanzees would be just as pantingly eager to listen to language as human babies are. But they're not. And what a difference it makes in their world. They never get to share discoveries the way we do, and to share our learning. That, I think, is the single feature about human beings that distinguishes us most clearly from all others, is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Our kids get the benefit of not just what grandpa and grandma and great-grandpa and great-grandma knew. They get the benefit of what everybody in the world knew in the generation and when they go up to school. And they don't have to invent calculus or long division or maps or the wheel or fire. They get all that for free. It just comes as part of the environment. They get incredible treasures, cognitive treasures, just by growing up. Oh, I've got a list as long as my arm of stuff that I've been trying to get time to read. I'm going to Paris in December and talking at the Dan Sperber conference, and I'm going to be addressing Dan's concerns about cultural evolution. I think he's got some great ideas and some ideas I think he's wrong about. So that's a very fruitful disagreement for me. Naturalism, moving naturalism forward, a nice conference that Sean Carroll put together out in Stockbridge a couple of weeks ago. And it was really interesting. I learned a lot. I learned more about how hard it is to do some of these things than, and that's always useful knowledge, especially for a philosopher. If we take seriously, as I think we should, the role that Socrates proposed for us as midwives of thinking, then we want to know what the blockades are, what the imagination blockades are, what people have a hard time thinking about. And one of the things that struck me about the Stockbridge conference was the signs of people really having to struggle to take seriously some ideas, which I think they should take seriously. And I was struggling too, because there were scientific ideas that I found it hard to get my head around. And that's interesting. It's interesting that you can have a group of people who are trying to communicate. They're not showing off. They're interested in finding points of common agreement, and they're still having trouble. And that's something worth seeing and knowing what that's about, because then you go into the rest of your forays. Sadder but wiser? Yeah, well, sort of. You at least are alert to how hard it can be to implant a perspective or a way of thinking in somebody else's mind. Well, to me, I realize I really have my work cut out for me in a way that I had hoped not to discover. That I think there's still a lot of really naive thinking by scientists about free will. And I've been talking about it quite a bit, and I did my best to undo some bad thinking by various scientists, and had some modest success, but there's a lot more work that has to be done on that front. I think it's very attractive to scientists to think that here's this several millennia old philosophical idea, and they can just hit it out of the ballpark. Which would be nice if it was true. It's just not true. And I think they're well-intentioned. They're trying to clarify, but they're really missing a lot of important points. And I want a naturalistic theory of human beings and free will and moral responsibility as much as anybody there. And but I think you've got to think through the issues a lot better than they've done. And here, actually, I think, in a happy way, it shows that there's some real work for philosophers. Well, first of all, philosophers have done some real work that they jolly well should know. Here's an area where one of the few times in my career when I wanted to say to a bunch of scientists, look, you got some reading to do in philosophy before you hold forth on this. There really is some good reading to do on these topics, and they don't want to hear that. Yeah, the figures about American resistance to evolution are still depressing. And you finally have to realize that there's something structural. You have to find something structural. I mean, it's not that people are stupid. And I think it's clear that people, everybody, me, you, we all have our authorities, our go-to people whose word we trust. If you want to question about, should we take the situation in Greece, the economic situation in Greece seriously? Is this really important? We have somebody whose opinion on that we think is worth taking seriously. We don't try to work it out for ourselves. We find some expert that we trust, and right around the horn, whatever the issues are, we have our experts. And so a lot of people have, as their experts on matters of science, they have their pastors. This is their local expert. I don't blame them for, well, I wish they were more careful about vetting their experts and making sure that they found good experts. I mean, they wouldn't choose an investment advisor, I think, as thoughtlessly as they go along with their pastor. Why blame the pastors? But where do they get their ideas? Well, they get them from the hierarchies of their churches. Where do they get their ideas? Up at the top, I figure that there's some people that really should be ashamed of themselves. They know better. They know better. They're lying. And when I get a chance, I try to ask them that. I say, doesn't it bother you that your grandchildren are going to want to know why you thought you had to lie to everybody about evolution? I mean, really. And they're lies. They've got to know that these are lies. They're not that stupid. And I just would love them to worry about what their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to say about how their ancestors were so craven and so arrogant. It's a combination of arrogance and cravenness. Everybody's got their personal go-to experts.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have to start working on that structure of experts and thinking, why does that persist? How can it be that so many influential, powerful, wealthy, in the public people can be so confidently wrong about evolutionary biology? How did that happen, and why does it happen? Why does it persist? It really is a bit of a puzzle if you think about how they'd be embarrassed not to know that the world is round. I mean, I think that would be deeply embarrassing to be that benighted, and they'd realize it. They'd be embarrassed not to know that HIV is the vector of AIDS. They'd be embarrassed to not understand the way the tides are produced by the gravitational forces of the moon and the sun. They may not know the details, but they know that the details are out there. They could learn them in 20 minutes if they wanted to. And how did they get themselves in a position where they could so blithely trust people who they'd never buy stocks of bonds from those people. They'd never trust a child's operation to a doctor that was as ignorant and as ideological as these people. It is really strange. I haven't got to the bottom of that. Linda Lascola, who's really a very talented investigator, questioner, interviewer, and I started a project where we found closeted, non-believing pastors, still had churches, and would speak in confidence to her. And she's a very good interviewer, and she got and earned their trust, and then they really let their hair down and explain how they got in the position they're in and what it's like. What is it like to be a pastor who has to get up and say the creed every Sunday when you don't believe it anymore? And they're really caught in a nasty thing, nasty trap. Well, when we published the first study, there was a lot of reaction, and one of the amazing things was the dogs that didn't bark. Nobody said we were making it up or it wasn't a problem. Every religious leader knows. It's their dirty little secret. They knew jolly well that what we were looking at was the tip of an iceberg, that there are a lot of pastors out there who simply don't believe what their parishioners think they believe. And some of them are really suffering. And some of them aren't, and that's interesting too. So phase 2, we've spread out and looked at a few more, and we've also started looking at seminary professors, the people that teach the pastors what they learn, and often are instrumental in starting them down the path of this sort of systematic hypocrisy, where they learn in seminary that there's what you can talk about in the seminary, and then it's what you can say from the pulpit. Those are two different things. And I think that this phenomenon of sort of systematic hypocrisy is a very serious, it is the structural problem in religion today. And churches deal with it in various ways, none of them very good. The reason they can't deal with them well is they have a principle which is a little bit like the Hippocratic Oath of medicine. First, do no harm. Well, they learn this, and they learn that from the pulpit, the one thing they mustn't do is shake anybody's faith. But if they've got a congregation, a parish full of literalist, young earth, literal Bible believers that believe that all the miracles in the Bible really happened and the resurrection is the literal truth and all that, they must not disillusion those people. But then they also realize that a lot of the parishioners, they're not so sure. They think it's all sort of metaphor. Symbolic, yes, but they don't take it literally true. How do they thread the needle so that they don't offend the sophisticates in their congregation by insisting on the literal truth of the book of Genesis, let's say, while still not scaring, betraying, pulling the rug out from under the more naive and literal-minded of their parishioners? And there's no good solution to that problem, as far as we can see. And since they have this rule that they should not, it would be just foolish and just wrong to upset, to undo, subvert the faith of anybody in the church. This means that there's a sort of enforced hypocrisy where the pastors speak from the pulpit quite literally. And if you weren't listening very carefully, you think, oh my gosh, this person really believes all this stuff. They're putting in just enough hints for the sophisticates in the congregation so that the sophisticates are supposed to understand, oh no, this is all just symbolic, this is all just metaphorical. And that's the way they want it. Of course, they could never admit it. You couldn't put a little neon sign up over the pulpit that says, just metaphor, folks, just metaphor. It would destroy the whole thing. You can't admit that it's just metaphor, even when you insist when anybody asks that it's just metaphor. And so this professional double talk persists. And if you study it for a while, the way Linda and I have been doing, you come to realize that's what it is. And that means they've sort of lost track of what it means to tell the truth. Oh, there's so many different kinds of truth. Here's where postmodernism comes back to haunt us. What a pernicious bit of intellectual vandalism that movement was. It gives license to all of this really pernicious sort of lazy relativism. One of the most chilling passages in that great book by William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, is where he talks about soldiers in the military and suggests that it's better to have them err on the side of ruthlessness and a sort of mad overconfidence, belief in the righteousness of their cause. They'll just be better soldiers. And actually, I mean, this is a very sobering reflection. Let's talk about when we went into Iran. there was Rumsfeld saying, oh, we don't need a big force, we don't need a big force, we can do this on the cheap. And there were other people, retrospectively we can say they were wiser, who said, look, if you're going to do this at all, you want to go in there with such overpowering, such overwhelming numbers in force that you can really intimidate the population and you can really maintain the peace and just get the population to sort of roll over. And that way actually less people get killed, less people get hurt. You want to come in with an overwhelming show of force. We didn't do that, and look at the result. Terrible. Maybe we couldn't do it. Maybe Rumsfeld knew that the American people would never stand for it. Well, then they shouldn't go in, because look what happened. But the principle is actually one that's pretty well understood. If you don't want to have a riot, have 4 times more police there than you think you need. That's the way not to have a riot. And nobody gets hurt, because people are not foolish enough to face that kind of those kind of odds. But now think about that with regard to religion, and it's very sobering. I put it this way. Let's just suppose that we face some horrific, terrible enemy, another Hitler or something really, really bad. And here's 2 different armies that we could use to defend ourselves. I'll call them the Gold Army and the Silver Army. Same numbers, same training, same weaponry. They're all armored and armed as well as we can do. The difference is that the Gold Army has been convinced that God is on their side, and this is the cause of righteousness. And it's as simple as that. And the Silver Army is entirely composed of economists. Oh my. And they're all making side insurance bets and calculating the odds and everything. Which army do you want on the front lines? It's very hard to say you want the economists. But think of what it means. What you're saying is, we'll just have to hoodwink all these young people into some false beliefs for their own protection and for ours. I mean, it's extremely hypocritical. It is a message that I recoil from. The idea that we should indoctrinate our soldiers in the same way that we inoculate them against diseases. We should inoculate them against the sort of thinking that might lead to them to think, am I so sure this cause is just? Am I really prepared to risk my life to protect? And do I have enough faith in my commanders that they're doing the right thing? What if I'm clever enough and thoughtful enough to have figured out a better battle plan, and I realize that this is futile? What am I still going to throw myself into the trenches or something? It's a dilemma that is, I don't know what to do about it, although I think we should confront it at least.